Andrew Solomon, and I'm from New York. I lived in London for a while, I lived in Moscow for a while, I've done a great deal of travel here and there, but New York remains home. I am a writer by profession. I wrote a book about depression called The Noonday Demon. I wrote a book about how families respond to children who are different from them in some way, called Far from the Tree, Parent, Children, and the Search for Identity. It dealt in part with gay identity as a subject that has engaged me across a lifetime. I am married to my husband. We have known each other for 16 years and been married for 10. That just a couple of weeks ago was our 10th wedding anniversary. I have a daughter with my closest friend from college. Mother and daughter live in Fort Worth, but we see them a lot. We go there and they come here. And then my husband John and I have a son together who lives with us here in New York. And I feel like at this point being a parent is probably my primary identity, being a husband is my second, and being a writer is my third. For me, growing up in New York was a very rich experience. The tragedy of my parents' marriage is that my mother's great love was art, and my father is colorblind, and my father's great love is music, and my mother was tone deaf. The result of this was that my mother took us to a lot of museums, and my father took us to a lot of operas, and one way or another I was really fully enmeshed in the whole cultural scene starting at quite an early age. I took classes at the Metropolitan Museum when I was a kid, and we got away for weekends and summers. We were lucky to be able to do that. We had a kind of little cottage partway upstate. I wasn't a very popular kid. I think I got a very good education. I was incredibly well prepared when I got to college. I kind of hated my school, but I always had some friends, and I feel like in general it was possible to be a little bit different here more than it was in those suburbs. And I was very definitely different, and I feel like I was given some leeway to be different that came of being in New York. The other kids on the bus mostly wanted to talk about trading baseball cards, and I wanted to tell them the plot of Aida. And I was very unathletic. I was kind of an aesthete and into various arts things starting when I was very little. And in some way I think I realized early on that I was different in ways that ultimately I would connect to being gay, but I sort of decided as a kid that if I was going to be different, instead of denying the difference, I was going to run with the difference. So I didn't really make much of an effort to fit in. I loved writing. I was writing poetry and things by the time I was 6 or 7 years old. I was very engaged with that. And I had a sort of disdain for pop music and athletics, which were really the only things you had to be interested in order to be popular. As I've said, when I was growing up I was kind of an odd child in many ways that a knowing observer might have associated with the possibility that I would turn out to be gay. I felt when I was growing up, as I gradually came to understand that I was gay, that it was a terrible tragedy, that I was sort of okay in so many other ways, but that in this one way I was going to be a colossal disappointment. And I would never have a family, and who knows, maybe I would end up being by myself for my whole life, and it was all going to be bleak and awful. And then as I got older, I was going to get AIDS and die. I mean, there was a lot of negativity around the idea, and I spent a long time trying to train myself not to be gay. I mean, I remember going and studying copies of Playboy and Penthouse and thinking, could I get interested? And then as I wrote in Far from the Tree, I went and did a round of something called sexual surrogates therapy, which was for people who had sexual problems, and it involved going off to meet these women in an office on West 47th Street that was not really a brothel, but it wasn't really anything else either. And these people you were encouraged to call doctors, prescribed these things you were encouraged to call exercises. With these women you were encouraged to call surrogates. And I was there trying to sort of train to be straight. And ultimately, I think I made some progress in those sessions, and I did later on have girlfriends at various stages, but the reason I had girlfriends was because I thought if I can only carry off being straight, I would have a better, happier life and be less of a disappointment to my family. It wasn't because I was really fully bisexual. I mean, I had some very nice times with some of them, but my underlying attraction was always to men. So then I went to college. I was still very closeted in college, though I think it was becoming increasingly obvious to people around me, but I was still in some ways closeted to myself. I wasn't really acknowledging it. And then I went to graduate school in England. And I went to graduate school in England partly because of a lingering Anglophilia that had been a part of me since I read Winnie the Pooh and other children's books set in the UK. But that also meant that I was going someplace that was really far away from the society I knew and the people I knew, where I would have an opportunity to experience something different. And up until that time I had been very attracted to various people, but I had never been in love with anyone. I didn't ever put my emotions and my sexuality together in one place. And when I was in England, I began hesitantly to express the idea that I was really gay. It was sort of at the end of my first year there, so I was 22, I guess it would have been the spring of 1985. And so then I felt like I was sort of acknowledging who I was to a small group of people, but not to very many. And that year I came home on spring break, and my mother said, "You've met all of these interesting girls in England. Are you interested in any of them?" And I said, "No." And she said, "How come?" She said, "Aren't you interested in anyone?" And I said, "I am sort of interested in someone." And she said, "Who is that?" And I said, "You actually met him. His name is Edward." And she said, "Well, I hope that's not something you're going to pursue," or something like that. I can't remember exactly. She said something sort of vague, and we then moved on quickly to other topics. And I finished out my graduate degree. It was a 2-year program, and I was still mostly in the closet, but not 100% in the closet. And I still had this idea that if other people knew, the world would come to an end. I mean, now here I sit on video talking about all of this very openly. I don't know why the idea of anyone else knowing seems so catastrophic to me, but I was utterly terrified of the possibility of anyone knowing that I was gay, and most of the sexual experience I was having by that time was with strangers, frequently in public places. And then in the autumn of 1987, I had moved to London, and my father was furious that I was moving to London. He said, "I didn't send you to graduate school in England so you could stay in England. You come home to New York." And I said, "I wouldn't come home to New York." And he said, I won't pay for you to live in England. And I said, "I'm getting a job. You don't have to pay for me to live in England." And we had a huge, huge family debacle about that. I don't think I really understood at the time that I was staying in England in part so that I could come out, but certainly that was a primary engine of my being there. And in the autumn of 1987, I met Michael, who was my first serious boyfriend, and I happened to be in the process of giving up the flat I'd been living in, and I had a new place that wasn't ready yet, so I just moved in with Michael a week after. I guess we met, and then we didn't see each other, and then we had dinner 3 months later, and that was the point when it sort of clicked that there was something there. And then a week after that dinner, I moved in with him and lived with him for nearly 2 years. And at that point, it all became irrefutable, and I started saying to people, "Yes, I'm with Michael." And I can remember my parents, who were the people I was most worried about coming out to, my mother saying, "Who is this Michael, and why are you living with him?" And I sort of said, she said, I don't want to hear this, I don't want to know this. You know, it was very, very painful to me. I felt like there was no level at which my family said, "That's so amazing, you've found love, and that's going to be so fulfilling, and, you know, have a wonderful time." I remember actually a conversation when I was the year before that, when I was still in England. They have these big parties in the springtime at the university I was at, and I had invited a friend up for this very fabulous party, an American friend, and that American friend was being sort of flirty with me, and I wasn't being very responsive, a woman friend. And at the end of the evening she said, "You know, some people like girls, and some people like boys, but it's really important to be interested in somebody." And it's a lot better to be interested in boys than not to be interested in anyone. And I was very taken aback by that. And she's someone who remains one of my closest friends. So that's out of sequence, but that was sort of a triggering circumstance, I think, in propelling me eventually toward Michael. And then I found coming out, you think when you read the narratives of it that are all over the internet now and in our popular culture, that there's sort of this moment and you make a declaration and then you're out and that's it. I found it was a sort of strange, gradual leaching process. I was writing a book about Russia. I was spending a lot of time in Moscow. I didn't tell anyone in Moscow. Eventually, some of the Russians got visas and came to visit in England. And at that point, there was no point denying it because they were staying with me. And it was a it was a kind of slow seeping sort of thing that happened. And then after my mother died, I wrote a novel which was partly about the struggle to come out. It's called A Stone Boat, and it's all about those years and about my mother's death from cancer. She died when I was 27. And then I had to go and do readings of the book, and I felt like, okay, now I have to stand up in front of large groups of strangers and read passages of a book in which I talk about being gay, and it was traumatic all over again. I feel like I was traumatized over and over again by coming out over and over and over again. I found it was very exhausting. My father's response was mostly, oh, well, this is very difficult for your mother, which, was not the most helpful and supportive thing he could say, even though he sort of said, well, you do whatever you think is right, but your mother really is struggling with this. I felt then and feel now that he could have taken my side more vigorously. I really wanted my mom to come and meet Michael, and she kept saying, I don't want to make this any more real to me than it is already. And so the summer after Michael and I got together, we were going on a family trip, and my parents invited my brother to come with his girlfriend, and I was invited to come, but I was not allowed to bring Michael. And I went on the trip, a decision I've since questioned, but I was sort of young and I liked those family trips, and I was living abroad and I didn't see the family that much. But I went on it determined that we would talk through this whole thing, and I would explain, you can't ever do this to me again. And then my mother was diagnosed with cancer while we were in Paris, and her sort of demise began. And by the end, she said all of the right things. She said, you should find someone who makes you happy and whom you can love and who will love you, and it doesn't matter whether that person is male or female, and do whatever is going to work for you. She said it, but I was never convinced that she really meant it. And I wonder whether if she'd lived longer, she would have gotten to the point of meaning it. I think probably she would have. But I also, and it's sort of part of the narrative of being gay and of coming out, I felt so much that I had to make this really tragic choice. I had to choose between being true to myself and honest about who I was and what I wanted, and having a family. And I really wanted to have a family. I had always been told when I was growing up how wonderful it was to be a parent. I think my parents, despite occasional ups and downs, found that it was the great and fulfilling experience of their lives. And I spent years kind of going back and forth between girlfriends and boyfriends, and it was partly because of my sense of the stigma of being gay, and it was also partly because I felt that I really wanted to have a family so much, and I thought that was the only way to do it. And then while I was going through all that Sturm und Drang within, the world changed, and the life I have now with a husband and children became possible. I mean, this life was unimaginable to me when I was growing up. It's not simply that I don't happen to have imagined it. Nobody imagined it then. And yet so relatively quickly it's become an available reality. But even now, when you ask about coming out, I'm on some meeting. I was at something a few weeks ago, and there was this sort of elderly gentleman. It's a board that I've been on for a while, and he said to me when we were making conversation, he said, I'd mentioned my son. He said, I think I've met your wife, haven't I? And I said, no, you haven't. And he said, no, I think I did. Didn't she come along to the last thing? And I said, no. And he said, oh, I was sure that I'd seen her. And I finally thought, okay, I just have to say it. So I said, I don't have a wife, I have a husband. You wouldn't confuse them. And I could see that he felt sort of reprimanded and reproached, and was clearly uncomfortable with it. And I thought, well, I don't want to make him uncomfortable, but I'm also not going to pretend that I have a wife instead of a husband when I actually have a husband. And even that word husband, John and I were talking about how 10 years ago when we got married, it still felt like a sort of active aggression so at the time to say, my husband. And now it really doesn't. That's part of what shifted, partly in me and partly in the society at large. But the coming out process it's long and it's slow. I don't think that I really lost very much in it. I mean, I don't think there was anyone I wanted to be friends with who didn't want to be friends with me because I was gay. I didn't have any friends who sort of were, I didn't really even have any friends who were particularly surprised, much less any friends who turned around and walked out on me. But I was on an assignment just a few years ago to write about tribal culture in the Solomon Islands, and before I went, one of the people who'd helped to organize the trip said to me, you know, don't mention to anyone that you're gay. They don't deal with it there. How far back in the closet am I willing to go for a research trip? And I decided not very far, and you know, if anyone asked, I was certainly going to say. On the other hand, I didn't need to announce it within seconds of meeting people. So it's ongoing, but it's come increasingly to feel important personally and important politically. We took in a gay Libyan refugee who now lives with my family. He was the one I had met briefly when I was reporting from Libya for The New Yorker in 2004, and had very little contact with since then. And there was someone from CNN who wanted to make a video about his experience of arriving in the United States, and he did his own coming out video, as it were, on CNN, which then sort of, he had been very worried anyone would see it in Libya, and I said, you just can't know, and it then became a big thing in Libya, and it's been downloaded 1 million times, and so on and so forth. And his story has been a, you know, it's been a complicated thing for him coming out again, and coming out to his family, to whom he wasn't really out, and in a larger circle. He's dealt with it with enormous dignity, but I felt as I've led him through that process that I was repaying some of the generosity of the people who came out before I did, the ones who fought for our lives and our liberty and made it possible for me to be out full-time as I am, for me to have a husband, for us to have children, for us to inhabit this more tolerant world. So my fervent hope is that 20 years from now someone will be sitting in a chair like this and saying, I can't believe how intolerant things were then. Now we have a more tolerant world. The fact that my parents were not ready allies informed my book, Far from the Tree, which is all about the ways in which parents arrive at that allegiance. And part of what I discovered as I worked on that book is that love is not the same thing as acceptance, and that parents can love someone very much and still have trouble accepting him, and that acceptance has to be a process that leads to further love, but that it doesn't always come so readily. I'm very aware now of those processes, but I find myself torn all the time. I mean, my son is 8, and you know, he wants to play video games for hours on end, and I think he should be reading a book and possibly learning to play the piano and developing some table manners. And I think to myself, am I just trying to make him into a replica of me and to impose a system of values that will always be alien to him? Or am I in some way helping him to become a better self that he'll be happy about being in the long run? I think I notice these things in a way that possibly my parents didn't notice them. And I try very hard to make my son feel celebrated for who he is. But parenting involves correcting your children all the time. That's how they learn, that's how they grow, that's how they become part of the family. And even though I'm aware of it, I think to myself all the time, am I doing this for him, or am I doing this for me? Is this a good thing to be doing, or is this going to be a problem for him as he gets older? Should I congratulate him on this thing that actually I find rather annoying? Do I laugh at that joke that I think is kind of gross and not very funny? At what point do I sort of set a limit? And I wish I could say that I'd figured it out and I was completely consistent. I'm not. Sometimes I laugh at the sort of stupid second grade jokes, and sometimes I say, George, come on, you don't have to tell jokes like that, at least not around the dinner table. I mean, I do all of it. So I don't know that I'm doing any better with it than my parents, but I hope that he will never have the feeling that I had before I came out and when I came out, that there was something so fundamental about me that my parents found horrifying. I hope he'll never feel that we found anything that was fundamental to him horrifying. Annoying, perhaps, but not horrifying. Well, I think the biggest challenge we face as an LGBTQ community is a separation in which the kind of life that I have with my husband, with my children, with the general social acceptance is a matter of my relatively privileged position in the society and my geographical location, and that what is available so readily to me is completely unavailable to a trans woman of color in some part of the Deep South, or to lesbians in Wichita. I recently interviewed some lesbians in Wichita for a project I'm working on, and I was just struck by how narrow their sense of possibility is. So I think that there is sometimes a tendency for people who see the kind of privileged folk either because they know them or because they're on TV, and who therefore think that basic liberties and rights don't require defending. I think there's a tendency for people not to recognize how much suffering is still going on among LGBT people because they are LGBT or LGBTQ. I'm on the board of the National LGBTQ Task Force, and I chose the task force over other organizations because it really works on social justice issues and tries to help people who don't already have a lot of rights. So on the one hand, I think it would be lovely for me to have more rights, and there are various rights I think it would be kind of cool to have. But the fact that there's bias in healthcare isn't an issue for me, and I'm not going to be thrown out of my apartment because I'm gay. But those are problems that people have and that can frequently genuinely destroy their whole lives. And so my concern is just that as altogether in America, the divide between those who have and those who don't have gets wider and wider. And even, I mean, I had my son through surrogacy, and it was lovely that John and I could do that, and he's my biological child and John's adoptive child, and he's glorious, and we're having a fabulous time being his parents. But I feel like there are lots of people who would like to have children, and you know, surrogacy is an expensive process. And I kind of think the world is unjust, and it sort of doesn't surprise me that some people can afford to take vacations in Paris and some people can't, and we'll never be able to equalize all of that. But having a family, getting married, knowing that you can stay in your apartment as long as you can pay the rent, those don't seem to me like luxuries. Those aren't trips to Paris. Those are things that should be equally available to all of us. And so I worry terribly that this divide is going to become more and more and more pronounced as the divide in our society does, and that the people at the top become blind to the suffering of those at the bottom, and the people at the bottom are too disenfranchised to be able to change their reality. I think it would be presumptuous for me to give a lot of advice to people who are genuinely disenfranchised. I think people who are genuinely disenfranchised can't just do all of the things I would advise them to do. You know, move to a city where there's a vibrant LGBTQ community. That would be good, but lots of people can't just move to a city like that. You know, try to get into a relationship and have people around you all know and accept the relationship. I mean, that's easy for me to say, but not so easy for a lot of people to do. I think what I would say, though, is that there is very little that is more valuable than your integrity, and if maintaining your integrity demands that you be open and honest about who you are, see if you can find the courage and strength to do that. And even if you can't be open and honest with everyone, try to have a world of people within which you can be open and direct and honest. And the other thing that is my advice to all disenfranchised people, which has sadly gone unheeded in the recent past, is to vote, to make your voices heard. We live in an electoral democracy in which everyone who votes has a voice on Capitol Hill, and the many people who don't vote don't have a voice on Capitol Hill, and often feel that the concerns of politicians are so high-flown as to be irrelevant to them, and they aren't irrelevant. The concerns that sound so high-flown are actually a crucial part of your human development. Carl Jung said, if you do not know a person, you are likely to think him a fool. A lot of the prejudice has come from the relative silence in which we have lived. I gave a big talk in which I quoted Harvey Milk, who once was asked by a younger activist, what is the best thing I can do for the movement? And he said, go out and tell someone. I feel like in 1965, I think it was, more than 99% of Americans thought they had never met a gay person. Everyone was so closeted and so shielded that this information never came out into circulation. But the reality is that when you know someone's story, you're more accepting of that person and of other people like that person. And if the LGBTQ narratives can be amplified, I think that they will increase acceptance, at least toleration. I also think that they're part of the exquisite diversity of humanity, and that having a humanity in which that diversity is not acknowledged and does not materialize into people's consciousness is a smaller, weaker one. And I feel like the culture wars of this particular moment, under this particularly appalling presidency, point to the idea that there are a lot of people who would like to go back to an America in which white male people were the ones who had the power, and people of color and people who are LGBTQ and women and many other categories have much less position and power. It's surprising to me how strongly that has continued to be the case. Amplifying the LGBTQ narrative is one of the many ways to fight that back, and to say, if you got rid of all the LGBTQ people, you would impoverish the society. People have to know who the LGBTQ people are and what their stories are to understand how terrible it would be to lose us and to lose what we have to say or think or sing or do. My favorite part about being me, my favorite part about being me is other people. So it's my children. I mentioned my daughter and my son. My husband is also the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. And we have these 4 children who are sort of in our orbit. And I still sometimes look at them and think, how did that happen? Remember, that was what I wanted. I wanted to be able to have a family. And now I have a family. And I have to sort of sometimes stop myself. I think, I have all this email to do. And then I think, no, sitting here on the floor playing with Lego, which on the one hand feels like an irresponsible use of time, is on the other hand the meaning of life. And the experience of being involved with those children with my husband and in our constant collaboration on more or less every aspect of their lives, that's been one of the richest and most rewarding experiences that I could ever imagine. And I suppose in the end, it sounds terribly hackneyed, the most valuable thing in anyone's life is love, and the most valuable thing in mine has been a lot of love that I didn't expect. And I think because I didn't expect it, it feels even more surprising to me than it does to many people who assume they would eventually marry and settle down and have a family.
Aw, that's great.
Good.
Anything else you want to add?
I think we've covered it. If you think of anything else I want to answer.
I think it was phenomenal.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Good.